Good evening. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. On behalf of the trustees and the overseers of the New England Aquarium, we'd like to welcome you to the New England Aquarium and the Simons IMAX Theater. Hope everyone's doing really well tonight. I'm Tom Burton. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees, or Board of Overseers, I should say. And I have to say that over the last 2 years of my involvement, I've found the aquarium to be one of the most fulfilling nonprofit experiences I've had so far today. It's been really terrific. Tonight we're privileged here to have our 8th of the series of lectures that we've lined up for this season. In the past, we used to have them in the Learning Lab, if you're familiar with those experiences. Now we've moved them here to the IMAX Theater, and we've got a little bit of extra space, and ordinarily I would probably say, hey, let's get a little bit closer so we can be closer to the lecturer and so forth, but probably not going to be needed tonight. I think we'll be just fine with what we've got, so I think you'll have a really a good evening. I'm here to have the privilege of introducing Heather Taussig, who has been a 20-year member of the New England Aquarium. She's the Vice President of Conservation and has done a whole myriad of activities involved with sustainability for the aquarium. In fact, so much so that I haven't had time to actually memorize what they are, so I'm going to sort of give you a little bit of a list of all of the things that she's been involved in. She's a senior lead for the Sustainable Seafood Programs, as well as senior sustainability advisor for all corporate partnerships and public outreach programs, and perhaps even more interestingly, the senior director of the Phoenix Island Protected Area Initiative, the Marine Conservation Action Fund, International Scientific Expedition and Policy Initiative, and World of Water Conservation Series. Really someone who's made a tremendous difference and impact here at the aquarium over the last 20 years. And so I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce tonight's feature speaker.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you very much for those kind words. Very nice to have a member of our board here welcoming you here tonight. Again, my name is Heather Taussig, and it's always a thrill to introduce speakers who really have made an impact on the world in which I work. And so I'm really thrilled tonight to be able to introduce Andrew Sharpless to you, who is the CEO of Oceana. And he is no stranger to us here in Boston. He actually holds degrees from Harvard Law School and Harvard College here, as well as the London School of Economics. But before I turn it over to him, I just wanted to let you know a little bit more about his background before he joined Oceana. And who they are. So just to tell you a little bit more about sort of his previous life, he served as the executive vice president at Discovery.com, which is really the online arm for the Discovery Communications world. And those might, obviously a very familiar platform for sharing the world of the oceans with people through media. And media is really a wonderful outlet for ocean education and engagement. So Andy brings a lot of experience in this world of media. He was also senior vice president of the initial management team, which launched something called Real Networks. For those of you that know of that, that was the company which pioneered online streaming media. So it's really kind of a real part of all our daily lives now. So that's really sort of wonderful background that he's really brought to Oceana, which is one of the largest international conservation organizations focused on the oceans. And you've been with them for 10 years now. So I am really thrilled to introduce you to Andy Sharpless. He's just recently put out a book, The Perfect Protein, and I certainly recommend this book to you all, and he'll be outside signing as well, this book. It's I'm sure he will hold it up, but I will also show you. A really wonderful story as we all grapple with the way that we impact the oceans through our use of our fork, which our sustainability fellow here at the aquarium, Chef Barton Seaver, likes to talk about and has worked a lot with Oceana to showcase what we can all do as we engage in how we think about the oceans and how we address these issues of seafood. So with that, I would please extend a warm welcome to Andy Sharpless.
Thank you, Heather and Tom. It's great to be here with you all. Very pleased to have a chance to talk to you on this rainy night. and to show you some ideas that I think you will be glad to know, and that are actually the ideas in this book that called The Perfect Protein that I wrote. Now I'm going to do you a favor and summarize all 3 big ideas in this book, so you don't have to read it, but you should go. As my friend Porter Dawson said to me, Andy, if you do this, who do you think is going to buy the book? You know, so please go, please get interested enough. Please go. I think this is on. Is it just not picking up loud enough? You mean it will work fine if I talk like this all night? Okay. All right. So, thank you, whoever was pointed that out. I appreciate that. So, can you hear me now? Good. So, there are 3 big ideas in this book. We can feed many more people in the world's oceans from a rebuilt ocean than people understand. On the order of 1 billion people a day could eat a healthy seafood meal every day if we rebuilt the world's oceans. Number 2, it is much more achievable to rebuild the world's oceans. It's much more practical to get that done than people understand. And number 3, the benefits of rebuilding the world's oceans go far beyond this enormous important thing of feeding hungry people, but they include reducing pressure on biodiversity on the land, reducing climate-forcing gases, reducing aquifer depletion. So those are the 3 big ideas. I'm going to explain those ideas in some detail here, and I'm going to look forward to taking your questions at the end of this presentation. But that's the essence of the book. Now, before I get into each of these, when we prepared for the book tour this summer, we brought in an expert advisor who advises authors who are about to go out on the road, and she said, get ready for the toughest 2 questions you will be asked. Number 1, why did you write this book? And number 2, which of the recipes in the back is your favorite one? So I promote this book to you. I will answer the second question if you want, and when the question and answer period. But there are actual recipes in the back here. And Barton Seaver, who's already been introduced, is one of the famous chefs who's nice enough to have put a recipe in the back here. This is a book about how the oceans can be a food resource. So why did I write the book? I think that the moment, it's like any book, you have to ask yourself, when does the idea really germinate? When, it's hard to know exactly when you get the idea to do something as ambitious as write a book. But I think the moment is when about 4 years ago, I'm in Geneva representing Oceania at the World Trade Organization. And I was there to have a meeting, among other people, with the Chinese ambassador to the World Trade Organization. And I went to see him, and I sat down in his office by Lake Geneva, and we had that view out the window that we've all seen in the movies of the famous mountain lake in this rather spectacular setting. He's a very polished and dapper man in his early 40s. And I said to him, in essence, China wouldn't want to have a plan where they were going to subsidize up a big Chinese fishing fleet and overfish the world's oceans, would you? And he looked at me and he basically said, the West has been fishing aggressively the world's oceans for centuries. We have 1 billion people in China we need to feed. We will take our turn fishing the world's oceans just like you have. And as I left that meeting, I thought, the ambassador has a point. Who wants to choose between whether we feed hungry people on the planet or not? And there are a lot of them. There are 1 billion people on the planet right now who don't have enough to eat. And nearly half of them live in major fishing countries. And we are headed for a planet which is going to have a lot more people on it. This is the familiar chart that shows you forecast in population growth. Depending upon your model, there will be 9 billion people on the planet by 2050. That's 2 China's worth more people than we have here now by 2050. And we're going to want to feed all those people. Now the problem is that the biggest driver of biodiversity loss on the planet is agriculture. So if you love the creatures that are struggling to survive on this planet with us, you need to protect the places that they live. And if you want to feed the hungry people who are coming along, you will cut those places down and plant them into cornfields. So on the land, we have a terribly difficult choice between biodiversity and feeding people. So what the world would like is a way to feed many, many hundreds of millions of people and not do it at the price of the forests that are necessary for the biodiversity on the planet. Wouldn't it be nice if the world's oceans, 71% of the planet, could feed as many people on the planet as possible? Well, it turns out that they could feed many more people than people understand. The world's oceans catch has increased over time, up until about the late 1980s when it peaked. And our estimate is that it will continue to decline until mid-century unless we intervene and fix the way we manage our oceans. And here's the good news. If we were to manage the oceans better, we could increase ocean productivity substantially. And we could actually get to a sustainable level of fish production year after year that would be larger than the previous peak. And we could, instead of looking at a mid-century where we're feeding about 450 million people a seafood, if you took all the fish and quantified the meal value of that, you could feed about 450 million people a seafood meal every day. If we turned this around and rebuilt the world's oceans, we could make that 700 million healthy seafood meals every day. And if we stopped feeding fish to animals, it could be 1 billion people every day eating a healthy seafood meal. Now, I said that the second point is that that very worthy goal is more achievable, more practical than you think. And here's the case. Let's look at some experience with rebuilding fisheries. And the experience shows that if you will stop overfishing and allow spawning stocks to rebuild, fisheries come back relatively quickly. This is an enormously robust and resilient part of nature. And if you give it a little help by stopping overfishing, which comes down to doing three things: set and enforce scientific quotas, protect nursery habitat, and reduce bycatch. That's the accidental killing of non-target species. You can see enormous improvements in fishery populations. Here's a chart showing you the U.S. haddock population in an overfished state, badly overfished for decades, over and over again. Round about, what is that, 1994, the fishery managers finally get around to doing their job and putting some limits on. What happens? Fish comes back. Here, we'll go to Norway. In Norway, the Norwegians overfished their herring population, drove it down to very, very low levels. Finally, around about 1990, the fishery managers get their act together. They put some limits on it. What happens? Fish come back. The Norwegian Arctic cod. These are not the famous Canadian cod, which are the tragedy that is the exception to the rule. Canadian cod, which were overfished, and when fishing restrictions were put in place, the fish did not come back, sadly, is the exception to the rule we are seeing here. These are their cousins in Norway. The cod's cousin, that is. They were overfished. When limits get put in place, the cod came back. This happens all over the world. This is a very optimistic picture. we're looking at. The difference between the red line and the blue line is the difference between the period before the sensible management practices were put in place and the period after they were put in place. What were those sensible management practices? In a word, stopping overfishing. The fish come back. Now, you're imagining that there's a problem in this good story I'm telling you so far, and you're thinking the problem is that the oceans look like an international place. And when you look at the map of the world, it looks like the oceans are under international jurisdiction. And in order to get sensible fishery management, what we're going to need to do is get the United Nations involved and have a convention and have a meeting. And it'll take a long time, and the results will be frustrating, and the enforcement will be weak, and it probably won't be a very pretty picture. And you're frustrated by that. Let me give you some good news. The most productive parts of the world's ocean, shown on this map, are close to the coasts. Most productive in terms of the quantity of fish caught each year from those parts of the ocean and the number of fish that live there. And about 30 years ago, the coastal countries of the world nationalized the coastal zones of the ocean. So out to 200 nautical miles off the coasts of every coastal country in the world, and we live in one here, nobody fishes except under the rules of that country, and that country gets to set the rules by itself. So the Americans set fishing rules in the American Ocean out to 200 nautical miles without negotiating with anybody. The Americans set the rules for the American Ocean. The Chileans set it for the Chilean Ocean. The Canadians set it for the Canadian Oceans. It's not an international conversation. It's a national decision. And that is shown, so that you have to think now about a new kind of map where the coastal zones of the world are basically national zones associated with the coastal country next to them. 200 nautical miles is more than 200 statute miles, in case anybody's wondering whether I'm pulling a fast one on you. It's a long way out there. Now, you're smart, so you're thinking, okay, but there's 100 plus coastal countries in the world. I'm glad that we don't have to have an international convention, but if we have to go to 100 countries and get them to stop mismanaging their oceans, that sounds like a grueling task. So we at Oceana made a list of the world's countries ordered by the size of their catch each year from their waters. The size of their catch in pounds from their waters each year. And we asked the question, if just the top 10 countries on this list were to do a good job in managing their fisheries, a sensible job in managing their fisheries, what share of the world's marine productivity could be delivered to the future in abundant shape? And the answer is 2/3. 2/3 of the world's fish come each year from the national territorial waters of 9 countries and the European Union. Now, the European Union is a fair country in this analysis because the 27 countries of the European Union assigned to Brussels the decision for fishing rules in the European Union. So for purposes of fishery management, the European Union is one country. It's one decision maker. So it's fair to have it be 9 countries plus the European Union. Now, you sharp-eyed people will notice that there are numbers there, not countries. Who wants to guess what countries are in the top 10 in the world? I'm pulling this out because otherwise I have to open up my shirt and show you the tattooed answers to this question. What countries in the world represent, catch, are at the top of this list? We're going to see how many of you can get this right. Come on, guess a country. What? United States is a good guess. United States is number 4. Well done. Where else? Canada. Canada is number 16. Not in top 10. What? Russia. Good guess. Number 5. Japan. Good guess. Number 9. Spain is part of the European Union. European Union is number 4, so you'll get partial credit for that question, sir. China, good guess, number 2. India, very good guess, number 7. You guys are doing awesomely well. Thailand is a bad guess.
Chile.
Number 22.
Argentina. Chile.
Chile, well done. Number 8. Iceland, number 11. Almost made it into the top 10.
Norway.
Norway, number 10. You guys are freaking brilliant. This is Boston. Unbelievable. Intellectual capital of the world. We've named a lot here. China, European Union, United States, Russia. We haven't named number 6.
Argentina.
No. 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 Indonesia. We've named them all now, except for number 1. Who's going to guess what number 1 is? Number 1 country, 12% of the world's marine protein by weight each year. 12% of the world's marine protein by weight comes from this one country's waters.
Brazil.
Not Brazil.
Peru.
Who said Peru? Peru is correct. Give this man a handshake on your way out. Peru is correct. What is the fish that is caught in Peru in such quantity that it produces 12% of the world's marine protein by weight? Anchovies, right. What happens to those anchovies?
Ground up into fisheries.
Anchovies are ground up into fish food. Well done, sir. 97% of the Peruvian anchoveta is ground up into pellets and fed to animals. Many of them fed to fish, many of them fed to salmon. And in the process, 3 or 4 or 5 pounds of healthy marine protein in the form of anchovies are converted into 1 pound of salmon. So this is a reduction activity. It's not a way to feed, it is not a sensible way to feed the planet from a biological perspective. So there it is. Very, very good news if you're a practical person and you want to deliver an abundant and productive ocean, well managed to the middle of the century. You can do it by getting these 10 countries, including the European Union, and you will get 2/3 of the world's marine fish productivity by weight into good shape. If you get the top 25 countries, you will get 90% plus of the world's ocean into good shape by mid-century. Very, very encouraging news. What do you need to do? Stop overfishing. Set and enforce scientific quotas, protect nursery habitat, reduce bycatch.
Don't eat salmon.
Salmon, yeah. Don't eat farm salmon. So I promised that the third big point here would be that there is benefits to doing this beyond the fact that we're feeding lots of hungry people and that we already have a billion hungry people right now on the planet. They deserve our help. So that's a good reason to do this. But should you need more, I'm going to offer them to you now. Animal protein, you might wonder how cost effective, just as a business question, if we want to give people animal protein. And by the way, when you think about the rising middle classes of Brazil and China and India, what will they want more of? They will want more animal protein. So this is a forecast by the United Nations to actually, the demand for animal protein is forecast to grow more rapidly than the rate in population growth. Population is growing at about 33% by mid-century. Animal protein demand expected to grow by 70% because of something that's good, which is the rise of people out of poverty in the middle class, and therefore a desire for more animal protein in their diet. So we would like to cost effectively produce this. This chart will show you the cost effectiveness of familiar animal protein. In metric tons of those animal proteins, lamb, beef, pork, poultry, aquaculture, per $100,000. And you are now wondering, how do wild fish compare as a business matter? How do they compare? How much of those do we get per $100,000? We'd like to see that we get a lot of them. The answer is most cost effective. Even now, even in a relatively mismanaged world ocean, they are very cost effective. How about fresh water? We all know that there are places in the world that are running out of fresh water. Aquifers are being depleted. People have shortage of the most fundamental thing that human beings need, fresh water. So how much fresh water is used in the production of these other familiar animal livestock, lamb, beef, pork, poultry? Here's 1,000 liters per kilogram of protein produced in those other categories of livestock production. How much fresh water are we using in comparison to these animal protein in the production of wild fish, ocean fish? A little bit in processing. Almost de minimis. Greenhouse gases. Livestock production is, you may be surprised to learn, one of the drivers of climate change because of methane emissions, chiefly from the rear ends of livestock. Think about that for a little bit. Kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of protein. It's the CO2 equivalent. In these other livestock categories, how much do you get in wild fish production? Very little. Chiefly in the form of diesel consumed by fleets to go catch fish. Now, how big is wild fish right now as a share of the human animal protein diet? This is the familiar categories of animal protein that human beings eat. And you're probably wondering, kind of what's the baseline? Are we starting from a very small share, or are we already a reasonable share of what people eat in animal protein? The answer is we are currently eating the same amount of animal protein in wild fish as we get from eggs on a worldwide basis. This is already a big part of how human beings get their animal protein. Here's another set of reasons. You all know that if you shift from red meat to wild fish, healthy fish, your doctor will reward you with a smile and praise. And she will tell you that you will get a reduction in heart disease, cancer, and obesity from that decision. This is healthy for us to eat. So we've already established that having more wild fish in the diet in place of animal protein delivers a lot of extra animal protein to the planet without requiring expanded terrestrial agriculture. That reduces the pressure on biodiversity, loss on the land. It's healthy for you. It uses less fresh water. It produces less climate change. It's cost effective. Now, if you were a big skeptic, and I have occasionally run into such a person, you might say, yeah, but I care about somebody who lives in the interior of a big continent who will never, ever see an ocean fish. And I want you to help that person because that person is very, very poor, and in the year 2050, we want to make sure they are able to survive. And my answer is that if we will help to rebuild the world's oceans and deliver to the middle of the century an abundant ocean, we can help that person because that person is probably eating grain products. And the global price of grain has already been increasing. We've been living through a period of a spike period in increases in the price of grain. This is data from the IMF on the core price of grain. And what eats a lot of grain? We've already talked about it, livestock. And if you have in the year 2050 a dramatically expanded livestock industry, because the oceans have been allowed to collapse, you will have a higher price of grain than you would have had if you have an abundant ocean. And so if you're somebody who never eats fish and you only eat bread, you have a reason to care and to benefit from restoring the world's oceans. And we're already in a price trend where that person should be worried. Another way of quantifying this benefit. There are these opportunities we have in our regular lives to choose between eating a hamburger and a fish fillet sandwich. And I want to quantify for you in very simple terms the planetary significance of that choice. When you choose to eat a hamburger instead of a fish fillet, you are eating something that comes from an agricultural industry that produced the cattle to make the hamburger. And that industry bought a lot of grain. And that grain was irrigated. And on average, that hamburger requires 10,000 glasses of water to be produced. It is equivalent to more than 200 tortillas worth of grain. And it produces an average amount of climate-forcing gas equal to the average commute. in the United States of America. When you eat the fish fillet sandwich, you don't. So you have a choice between having that much of a planetary impact or not in that choice. The global scale of that is pretty obvious. If you add it up, you get an awful lot of water from this industry being consumed on a global basis. You get an awful lot of land being used by the livestock industry, or not, if you're eating wild fish. You get an awful lot of annual emissions of climate-forming gases from this industry, or not, if you're eating wild fish. And you get grain differences that are obvious and enormous. So here we have a resource where the horrible opposition that we talked about at the beginning of this evening between feeding hungry people and protecting biodiversity, protecting life on the planet, isn't happening. In the ocean, these things that are adversaries on the land are actually allies of each other. The things that we could do to rebuild the ocean, to make it abundant as a food resource, will also strengthen the ecosystem of the ocean. Will strengthen the biodiversity of the ocean. The things that we do to promote biodiversity in the ocean we're eating the wild resource. So the things that we're doing to strengthen it as a food resource strengthen the wild creatures that live there. The creatures that eat fish in the ocean are going to be happy if there's a lot of fish in the ocean, just like we are. And as we've already talked about, the creatures on land that are suffering from biodiversity pressure because of agriculture will benefit if we have an abundant ocean. And of course, hungry people who love seafood and people who love scuba diving will benefit. So this is an opportunity with enormous benefits across a wide range of values that we all care about, starting with this wonderful one that we all don't want to have to choose between biodiversity protection and feeding people. This is a place where we can achieve both those goals at once. So that opportunity is one the world needs to seize. It's practical for us to do it, and there are enough success stories for us to believe that it actually can get done. So I want to take your questions here. I have many more things I can talk to you about, but I also want to save some time for questions. So, yes.
I have
Two questions, yes.
So if we go back to the countries, the top 10 countries.
Go back to the top 10 countries. Let me see if I can do that here.
I was just wondering about how important it is if all of them agree. Say if China doesn't, would there be enough mass with the others to sustain an ocean if China's still overfishing like mad?
So the question was, how interdependent are these countries, and how much do they each need to cooperate? And if somebody doesn't play along, like a big one, like China, you asked about in your question, what happens then? Can we still get to where we need to get to? I'm trying to repeat your question so everybody can hear it. And the answer is, there's much less interdependency. There is not enough. The answer is we can get where we need to without. It's not a system situation where everybody needs to play along for it to work. It can be done country by country. This pie chart shows you the catch from the waters of that country. So if China doesn't play along, they're number 2. There's a lot of potential productivity that's lost, but the share of potential productivity is lost is shown by that pie chart. And the rest of the countries can do a good job in their ocean and make their oceans productive. Now that assumes that a country is well enough managed so that they know who's fishing in their waters, and they have a Coast Guard like the United States does that can enforce the rules and make sure that people who are fishing under the rules. Many of these countries meet that standard, in my judgment. I mean, if you were randomly throwing darts at the world's map and worried that you were going to get countries that are famously incompetent or corrupt or unable to execute at all, you would be happy if you came up with this list. They're not all great. I don't want to defend every single one of them, but they're a pretty good list. And many of them can be trusted in their own self-interest, after all, they're not doing this for the greater good of humanity. They're doing this with their ocean to the benefit of their fleet and the benefit of the business opportunity and long-term sustainability that creates. This is not asking them to do something that only saints will do. So the place where the interdependence occurs is in the high seas. And in the high seas, which is the zone, the international zone of the ocean beyond 200 nautical miles, we have a serious problem because those zones are managed through international committees, and those committees tend to do a terrible job, sadly. They tend to, after much negotiation, to agree on a very lowest common denominator outcome and then to agree that will not be enforceable. This is not good work that we see from our international system. They should agree on sensible scientific limits, and they should agree to make it enforceable, but they tend, sadly, not to do that. They could get their acts together and do better, but they don't generally. There are some success stories. We have seen some, recovery in whale populations, which is a success story. But bluefin tuna, for example, a predator fish that likes to go out into the high seas. So the fish that go out into the high seas influence, by the way, our perspective of the world's oceans because they tend to be the charismatic creatures. We tend to, the top predators, the lions and tigers of the ocean, tend to capture our imagination more than the bunny rabbits of the ocean. And so anchovies, which you were informed enough audience to get to very rapidly a moment ago when we talked about Peru, don't jump to people's minds the way tuna and sharks, swordfish do. So we are misled by those charismatic creatures into thinking that the high seas problem, which is very intractable, must be solved. It needs to be solved for those creatures, but it doesn't need to be solved for the bunny rabbits. And it turns out that from a point of view of feeding people, a pound of bunny rabbit is as good as a pound of tuna. A pound of sardines, to be more specific, is as good as a pound of tuna. And indeed, from the point of view of where is life in the ocean, where are most of the creatures in the ocean, most of them are in the coastal zone. So if you're just a biodiversity lover, this is where most of life is also. So I'm sorry we all worry about the predators that are out there in high seas, and we ought to do a better job to save them, and I don't want to consign them to a dismal future. But the difficulty that we have in forecasting how that's going to get done shouldn't obscure the opportunity we have in the coastal zone. You said you had a second question.
The next one, actually, is a bit of a follow-on. Among that biodiversity, especially in the Pacific right now, there's a lot of people are talking a lot about the radiation from Fukushima and just a lot of the pollution that's come out of storms in Southeast Asia. And I was wondering if you had any data or thoughts on how that might affect these populations if we work to raise them using the major food source.
So the question was, what about, oversimplifying a little bit your question, but the question about what about pollution and the impacts of pollution on fishery productivity broadly? Is that a fair, short summary of your question? So, a couple things to say about that. Most people, when you ask them, when you tell them, look, the oceans are collapsing and fishery catches are coming down, and you say, what do you think is driving that? The first answer you get is a pollution answer. Most people who are just reading the paper think that, well, they imagine Exxon Valdez, they imagine British Petroleum, Deepwater Horizon, the Gulf of Mexico, they picture a pollution problem, and they picture that's what's driving ocean collapse. Turns out that, as I've already explained, the acute driver of ocean collapse is not pollution, it is overfishing. And that actually is good news, because we know how to fix overfishing, and fixing pollution is much more difficult, because pollution tends to be built right into things that we really want. So when we turn on the lights at home, we want there to be a power plant. And when we start the car, we want it to start. And when we, go to the grocery store, we want there to be cheap bread, and that means there's agricultural runoff from the agricultural zone in the United States and wherever. So these are problems that are harder to solve than the problem of overfishing, which just requires that you set and enforce scientific quotas, reduce destruction of nursery habitat, and protect and reduce bycatch. So the very, very good news is that that the global problem of fishery collapse and the opportunity to turn it around does not require that you solve the pollution problems. There are regional effects of pollution that are serious in some particular places and serious in those places. The Chesapeake Bay has a dead zone caused in the summer by agricultural runoff and a bloom in algae, which then dies off and takes the oxygen out of the water. The Gulf of Mexico has a dead zone problem. Similarly, serious in those places, but not on the scale that they affect the global opportunity for a well-managed ocean. Plastic, you've all heard about in the Pacific. Serious problem, troubling problem, very hard to solve problem. We should find a way to solve it. We could speculate about how to do that. I had not heard anybody come up with a solution that I considered to be genuinely effective on that. I think it's kind of outrageous that the plastic industry is permitted to manufacture and release on the world a substance which lives for a very, very long time, and to just let it sit out there. There's almost no other industry in the world that gets to do that. Maybe the nuclear industry gets to do that. But we don't generally allow industries in well-managed countries to just release a product that becomes a waste product and that lives for millions of years or or tens of thousands of years. So it's morally reprehensible, but somebody has to probably come up, well, I don't know what the solution is. Most of the solutions that people talk about in plastics have a kind of a symbolic effect. You convert from plastic grocery bags and you're doing something modestly helpful, but you're not really solving the world's oceans problem. I mean, you're sending a symbolically significant message, but you're not actually solving the world's oceans problem. So those are Fukushima you mentioned. I'm not an expert on the situation in Fukushima, but I have looked into whether we have to worry about the radiation levels in fish, and the serious science that I've seen on this is that we do not. This is not a serious level of radiation into fish that we get in the United States, and that terrible event doesn't create that kind of problem. So that's my good news story, really, about pollution. The one big serious pollution problem that is a threat to the world oceans is acidification of the world's oceans. About 20 to 30% of the CO2 that we put into the air is absorbed by the ocean. And in the process of that absorption, the chemistry of the oceans changes, and its pH level lowers, and it becomes more acidic. And if you are a creature that makes your shell out of calcium, it's a problem if the water you live in, the seawater you live in, is becoming more acidic. And there is a place, if we continue to emit CO2 into the atmosphere, and it will be absorbed by the ocean, there is a place where we will start to see horrible effects on ocean productivity. The reefs will die. Creatures called pteropods that are at the base of the food chain that salmon like to eat will not be able to make their shells. They will suffer. We will see big impacts. Nobody knows exactly when that happens. Science hasn't given us a good answer as to what the window of time is that we have with respect to the oceans to stop putting too much CO2 into the air and to stop acidification effects from being catastrophic in the ocean. But the fact that they haven't given us an answer suggests that we have some time. If it were around the corner, we would know. So I, again, want to say to you, this is yet another reason why we should be working to save the planet from excessive CO2 emissions. It's not actually a commonly understood reason. Acidification is not well understood. So this is another reason to get behind the same sets of solutions that people are proposing to try to reduce CO2 emissions. But I want to emphasize, it's not a reason to get discouraged about saving the oceans. I don't think that we're on the precipice so that you should just throw up your hands and give up. One last thing about acidification. Climate skeptics of climate change, the general argument about warming of the planet related to CO2, assert that it's very likely, and I'm not a climate skeptic to be clear here, but what they say is it's possible that these weather changes and temperature changes that we are seeing on the planet that are caused by natural variations in solar radiation that aren't well enough understood, and that the argument that many of us make, me included, that we have to control CO2 emissions because they are driving climate change is false, or potentially false. So that's the climate skeptical argument. That skeptical argument is not correct with respect to acidification, because the changing chemistry of the ocean is a straightforward chemical consequence of absorption of CO2 by the ocean, from the atmosphere to the ocean. And we know that there is more CO2 in the atmosphere now, 400 parts per million, than there has been in 800,000 years. And that's not arguable. So the skeptics can't argue about how much CO2 is in the atmosphere, and they can't argue about whether it's being absorbed by the ocean, and they can't argue about whether that drives the pH down. So you can be skeptical about, which I am not, about whether the climate change is being occurred by CO2, but you can't be that about acidification. So if you're ever in a conversation with such a person and you want to get them to kind of care about CO2, this is a way to do it. Other question? Yes?
Andy, can you speak about aquaculture and where aquaculture plays into this big picture in the food?
So the question is, can I talk about aquaculture and how that fits into the picture of feeding the planet and using the ocean? So it seems very intuitive. Thank you for that question. It seems very intuitive, doesn't it? That one way to save the oceans is to farm fish as much as we can. Farm ocean fish as much as we can. And it seems very intuitive that if you were eating, for example, a salmon that was farmed, you might be doing something good for the planet because you weren't putting pressure on the wild salmon fishery. Well, we've already established that if you're eating a farmed salmon, you're eating a fish that was fed wild fish that were ground up into pellets, and the process converted 3, 4, 5 pounds of wild fish into 1 pound of farmed salmon. So guess what? You're not helping the wild fishery of the ocean if you're eating farmed salmon. So the category of farmed fish that are carnivores, fish that are fed fish, is not a good category to be farming. The category that is good to be farming is the category that loves to eat algae. And what's a creature that loves to eat algae? Oyster, clam, mussel. And if you're farming those guys, you are doing something that is very good for the planet. And we strongly support that. Why is that so good? Well, first of all, you're producing healthy animal protein for human beings to eat from something that human beings don't want to eat, algae. Number two, they're filtering the ocean as they grow. They're actually cleaning the ocean as they grow. Everybody knows this story, I assume. Chesapeake Bay, year 1600. John Smith is exploring on his way to meeting Pocahontas. He loses a cannon overboard. In his journal, he writes about it. He looks overboard 20 feet down. He sees a cannon over the side of his boat. Any of you who's been to the Chesapeake Bay lately, if you looked over the side of a boat, you don't see more 18 inches. It's so algae-filled. Chesapeake Bay used to go through an oyster. The entire bay went through an oyster every 3 days. When the bay was so filled with oysters that they were marked on charts as navigation hazards. The oysters got mined out. They got subject to disease. The entire bay goes through an oyster now about 3 times a year. The bay is filled with algae. There's also agricultural runoff problems. There's chicken farming problems. There's sewage problems. So the bay has other issues. So we love the mollusk farmers, the clam farmers, the oyster farmers, the mussel farmers. There's another reason to love them, which is that in the world, there's nothing more credible with a policymaker or a politician than a successful business. There's nobody that our political leadership likes to care more about than people who are creating jobs, making money, supporting the local community. And guess what a successful oyster farmer is doing, or a clam farmer is doing? It's a business. They're giving people work. They're making money. And guess what? If a polluter moves into that zone, that little company will be a fierce ally in the battle against the polluter, because you can't sell tainted oysters. You can't sell clams that taste like pollution. So this is a wonderful thing to have if you care about a clean ocean. It's a business that will really be a fierce ally in the battle against ocean pollution. So we love that. Now the category in the middle, what's left? So we've talked about farming of creatures that are carnivores, that eat other fish, and farming of creatures that eat algae, bad, good. In the middle, there is a category that I'm kind of indifferent about, although and that's the creatures that eat grain. So what's an example of a farmed fish that eats chiefly grain? Tilapia, catfish. So if you're running a tilapia or a catfish farm, it's essentially you're like operating a chicken farm underwater. From the point of view of the planet, that's what you're doing. Now, the people who defend tilapia farming as, and I've been in audiences like this, fiercely challenged for not being nice enough to the tilapia farmers. Because people say, they point out correctly, that if you think about a tilapia as a biological engine for converting grain into animal protein, you would point out that that engine is more efficient than the chicken engine at converting grain into animal protein. So that is true. Tilapia are more efficient at converting X amount of grain into Y amount of animal protein than chickens are. Now, why would that be? Why are they a more efficient biological conversion engine? Why? Give me a guess, somebody. What? Water. What about the water? I can't see who's talking. Resources needed for the chicken? No, that's not the right answer. Repeat the question. Why are tilapia and catfish more efficient at converting a given amount of grain into animal protein than a chicken is? It's just interesting to think about. I'll give you the answer. What?
They don't use water?
They don't.
Fresh water.
They don't need fresh water. It's not the right answer. That's the second time that answer was tried. So you have company over here. Yes. Cold-blooded. Yes. Who said that? Well done. They're cold-blooded. Why does that make them more efficient?
Don't use energy to warm the body.
Correct. No use for energy to warm the body. So the tilapia and the catfish is cold-blooded compared to the chicken. It's not burning calories to keep itself warm. So those calories can go into growing. So that's reason number one. There's one other reason. What is it? Another reason why that's more efficient? You didn't do your homework. What? Anybody have a guess? I'll tell you. No. That's from a system planetary point of view, it's a fair point, but I'm talking about the biology, the efficiency of the biology of the creature. Why is it more efficient? The answer is they live in a world where they don't experience gravity. They float. Chicken has to stand on its little feet all day long. So that's the little journey through aquaculture. Good, bad, kind of indifferent. You know, I just one qualifier. Even the shellfish farmers, we love them. You need, the details matter. There are some shellfish farms that create problems, but it's relatively easy to run a shellfish farm in a way that's sensible and good for the planet. There are some people who make mistakes. I don't want to endorse every single such operation in the world, but most of them are very good. Other question? Yes?
You left this pie chart up too long, so we got to study it. And you gave the optimistic view, which is, look, we only got 24 countries to deal with, so that's a manageable number. But if we sit here and we stare at this chart long enough, we see that China, the European Union, Russia, Indonesia, India, and everybody to the left of Iceland on your pie chart have done a really bad job in managing their fisheries. So the more pessimistic view would say 75% of those 24 countries are really bad actors.
So
what do we do to,
yeah.
what has to be done to transform the behavior and
Yeah.
the practices and the policies of
Yeah.
those countries?
Very fair question.
Solve your problem.
Very fair question. But so the question, just so everybody can hear it, is look hard at this pie chart showing the top 25 countries that control most of the marine protein productivity in the world, and you could talk yourself into being less optimistic than I've presented here today, because you could say there's a lot of countries here with a dismal record of ocean management, and so why am I so optimistic that we can fix those bad actors and get them to do a good job? And let me tell you some facts that I think are optimistic. European Union has mismanaged its fishery, but it's just reformed its common fishery policy. That will be in place by the end of this year, and under the new fishery policy, they are requiring quotas to be scientifically set, requiring habitat to be protected, and requiring no discards of fish at sea. They used to make all those things permissive, and now they are requiring them. That's going to, we believe, produce a 40% increase in the European ocean's abundance by 2020. That's now built in, Bud, to what the Europeans have done. The Americans are another story where we tightened up our laws in the 90s and again in 2006 and have gone to a situation where we now no longer have any active fishery that's being pushed downwards. We have some that need to rebuild, but we are not making anything worse in the United States. We've protected a lot of habitat. We've done a very good job by and large. The Chileans, number 8 on this list, same exact thing. In January of this year, Sebastian Piñera, pushed in part by Oceana, rewrote the laws of fishery management in Chile and made it mandatory that they do quotas, habitat, and bycatch. So we have success stories. We can all be very optimistic about Peru, I think. China is a big question mark. Russia is a big question mark. The rest of those countries, India would be a difficult place to operate in for all, it's a complicated, huge country. Indonesia, I think, is difficult but not impossible. Japan, I think, is difficult but very law-abiding place. If you could get them to have sensible rules in their own ocean, they would enforce it. They're serious about that. I think that, we can each make our own judgments, but I look at that list and say, when you're appealing to the self-interest of these countries about getting more fish in their water, which they will have a chance to catch and have their fleets catch and their people sell and their people eat, you're making and you can show them how to do it, and you can show them all these success stories, and you can show them sensible, well-managed countries like I just mentioned, the United States, Chile, the European Union, doing it. I think we have a pretty compelling story. I think time is about out. I'm going to do one more. Well, I see several questions here. I don't want to run too long. I need some help from the aquarium. So,
We can give you another hour.
yeah. All right, so I'll do a little more than one question here. So, yes, sir.
What can we as individuals do to help solve this problem?
What can we as individuals do to help solve this problem? In the book, we talk about several rules. I'm going to find them here. And then I'm going to explain them. Eat wild fish. Eat small fish. Eat local fish. And then eat all the farmed mollusks that you can stomach. And I'm sorry to say, because I like shrimp, there's no way to eat shrimp and feel good about it. Stop eating shrimp. I'll explain each of these. Wild we talked about. In general, wild fish are better than farm fish because they are, well, for all the reasons we've talked about. Small fish are lower down on the food chain. They tend to reproduce more quickly. They tend to be more abundant. They also tend to be less contaminated because contaminants tend to bioaccumulate up in the longer-lived fish, so they're healthier for you. If you'll eat local, if you're an American and you eat local, you can eat 90% of the seafood we eat in the United States is imported. 90%. If you'll eat, most of the world's oceans are not as well managed as the American ocean is. So the odds are, if you're eating an American fish, you're eating something that's better managed than something imported. So that's the reason to eat local. And then eat all the farm mollusks that you possibly can. We've talked about that at length already. And then shrimp. When I was promoting the book, the first big meeting I had, press event I had was on CBS this morning, and Tom Hanks was the guest with me. I was thinking, I'm dead. The most famous portrayer of a shrimp fisherman. The reason I don't want you to eat shrimp is wild shrimp are caught in nets that have very small mesh. Shrimp are appropriately named. They're very small. You have to have a mesh that catches everything, pretty much, in the water column in order to catch the shrimp. In the American fishery, the bycatch ratio is at least 3 pounds to 1 pound. So 3 pounds of non-shrimp, including things you really worry about, like turtles, for every pound of shrimp. So when you're eating that pound of wonderful wild shrimp, you have to picture all this other stuff that got brought up and dumped out on deck, some of it dead and dying and discarded at sea. It's not a pretty picture. The world's wild shrimp fishery is not as selective as the American wild shrimp fishery. The ratio is going to be worse. The alternative is farm shrimp. Farm shrimp tend to come imported into the United States from places where regulations are very weak. Coastal zone, mangroves are often cut down, shallow ponds are built. The shrimp are farmed in these shallow ponds to the point where they're dosed heavily with food and then dosed heavily because they're so densely packed that they get dosed with pesticides. It's not a pretty picture. Often the shrimp farmers do that until they can do it no more, and then they move on, leaving behind these kinds of empty, contaminated ponds. It's not a pretty picture. Last thing you can do as an individual, and then I'm going to let you all go home because it's a rainy night, is you could support passage of the Safe Seafood Act. If we, as a 90% importer of fish from the world, were to require that every fish sold in the United States of America was traceable, bait to plate, and that you could get the information as a purchaser of fish about where that fish was caught, who caught it, when it was caught, what the gear was, and the chain of custody about how it came up to you, that would benefit the world in several ways. First of all, it would benefit you because you would make it much harder for you to be defrauded. And Oceana ran studies doing DNA tests all across the country and discovered about a third of the time the fish that people were buying was not the fish they were sold. There is a lot of substitution going on there, which is just straightforward consumer fraud. And it would be much harder to do that if the seller to you had an obligation to answer your question with traceability data. FedEx can tell you exactly where your Amazon package is all along the way. It's technically very doable for the commercial fleet, fishing fleet, to do this on fish sales. Same thing, you're probably aware that the Food Safety Marketing Act in the United States now requires this to be done for produce. So there is traceability, for example, on blueberries and strawberries, so that if there were ever to be a contamination problem, the government can get in and figure out where it is. That's being done. So this is technically very old style stuff. It's not being required of the fishing industry. Second benefit is that we would project our expectation of legal conduct out onto our suppliers. And so the 90% that's supplied to us by non-American fleets would have to come from more legal conduct. If the people were catching fish out of season with the wrong gear, in the wrong places, it would be harder to hide that if traceability was genuinely required. So we have an opportunity as a big purchaser of seafood to project higher standards onto our suppliers. Does the American fleet like this? Yes. 26 American fishing groups support this law. This law was introduced into both houses of Congress. In the Senate by Senator Begich. In the House by then Congressman Markey, now Senator Markey, from a place far away from here. Those are both fishing states, Alaska and Massachusetts. The fact that this law was introduced by fishing state senators suggests that this is good for American fleets. It's good for American consumers. It's good for the world's oceans. So we hope you will contact your senators and congressmen and tell them to co-sponsor this bill. I want to thank you for your attention. Please keep coming to the aquarium. The aquarium is a wonderful place. And it's wonderful to see a group of people who are ready to come out on a night like this and talk about fish. Thank you.